Lloyd vs Enemy Lloyd is one of the biggest standouts when it does come to Season 4 Part 1 of Dragon's Rising. Honestly, it's definitely been one of the more talked about aspects, for all of the right reasons. There is a lot of amazing details and a lot of different choices made during this fight that I really do think amplify how good this fight truly was, and of course taking the amount of runtime that it did really did give the time to flesh out the dynamic between the two. I've already talked about Enemy Lloyd once before, and if you haven't watched that video, I'd highly recommend you do so. But besides that, I did want to actually go back to the fight between the two of them and take a look at that individually. Take a look about how they both react, the attacks they both make, and the interactions between the two. Analyze what was truly going on and identify the moments where Enemy Lloyd may have been winning or Good Lloyd may have been winning, and just honestly just appreciate what they actually created here. So let me not waste any more of your time and let's talk about the best Season 4 fights. This fight takes place within the trial of the Green Ninja. Lloyd is walking into the trial's variation of the Monastery of Spinjitzu. Lloyd actually initially thinks there's some form of vision, but Lloyd has actually gone there wondering who his true enemy actually is. He is questioning what the logistics of the situation is, until he turns around and he sees a dark reflection of himself. Evil Lloyd smugly says, "Hello Lloyd," and our real Lloyd physically cannot believe that his greatest enemy is actually himself. Evil Lloyd scoffs at this denial, and honestly is quite fascinated by it. He begins to tell Lloyd about all of the things that he does wrong, how he blames other people for his own mistakes. This visibly angers Lloyd, but as soon as he's without Evil Lloyd in his vision, he actually goes to being sad about it, which is an interesting detail. It's like he acknowledges this to be the case, acknowledges the fact that he doesn't tend to blame himself, but I don't exactly think he does it on purpose. Evil Lloyd then proceeds to go into a monologue about how Lloyd isn't a leader by any account, talking about how Lloyd will never live up to Wu or even Cole, and even says about how Lloyd has led the ninja to near certain doom on multiple instances. This actually does cause Lloyd to recoil at that information. It's a very subtle detail, but I do like it. It's like he never realised that there have been moments where the ninja have nearly come to their own end. But during all of this, Evil Lloyd actually does put his hands behind his back and actually leans into Lloyd in this moment. This is actually a very interesting move. It makes Lloyd believe that there's nothing to worry about, there's no reason to actually be hesitant or no reason to be on guard, and actually there should have been, because Evil Lloyd takes that opportunity and actually brings his arm around and proceeds to punch Lloyd in the shoulder. This actually hurts Lloyd, which is interesting, showing the strength that this version of him actually does have, and beyond all of that, also does show that Lloyd wasn't expecting it because he physically recoiled in the moment. But that is actually only the beginning. After the initial hit to the shoulder, Lloyd is still off guard, and Evil Lloyd takes advantage of that and actually kicks Lloyd to the ground. That strength in the kick was also palpable. It is extremely strong, and it definitely does show how much regular Lloyd does truly hold back. But Evil Lloyd just continues to berate Evil Lloyd whilst on the floor, even placing his foot on Lloyd to keep him down. Lloyd does try to push him off, but again another kick does ensue, re-pushing him into the ground, with again a lot of force. It shows that there's a lot of strength behind these instances, but Evil Lloyd is just berating him, talking about how Wu just simply hasn't returned because Lloyd is a failure, talking about how the ninja would be much better off without Lloyd, and honestly, it is very clearly getting to him. This is shown by the fact that Lloyd does push Evil Lloyd off and actually goes to do an initial attack. He goes to punch Evil Lloyd many times, but every single time, Evil Lloyd is able to dodge them with precision. And not only that, is honestly just smiling about it. He wants this to happen, and honestly, he was kind of just expecting it to be the case. And it's followed up by Lloyd trying to do Spinjitzu, which Evil Lloyd stops with no issue whatsoever. The power of Evil Lloyd is crazy to see. After this moment, Lloyd is actually starting to get visibly shaken up, saying that Evil Lloyd is just simply lying and it's not actually true. Evil Lloyd replies to that by saying, "You know this is a lie because I know it's the truth." Obviously because they are the exact same person. He proceeds to punch Lloyd once more, and again, unlike Lloyd, Lloyd is actually taken aback by it. He physically is dragged back after that punch. It is, again, just palpably strong, and to an extent, in the speech, the background music, and just generally speaking, reminded me of Harumi. But of course that's by design because the soundtrack is used. After that punch, Lloyd then actually goes to use Rising Dragon technique, which I do think is a fairly interesting decision, and honestly to an extent harps back to Season 2 Part 2 when Lloyd talks about the usage of Rising Dragon. Lloyd has always stated that Rising Dragon should only be used as a counter to Shatter Spin, and to see him use it against something that isn't Shatter Spin I think is fairly interesting, honestly showing to an extent a level of desperation. Using a very powerful move in reaction I do think says a lot about Lloyd's mental state, and I think Evil Lloyd even acknowledges that, because Lloyd does it and Evil Lloyd does not look impressed. It is the first time he actually loses his own smile, and it proceeds to use Rising Dragon himself because it was the perfect counter to it. Evil Lloyd then proceeds to use a couple buzzwords that Lloyd is very familiar with. Ninja never quits, but uses it in the sense to show Lloyd that he should quit, saying that Lloyd should leave and the ninja would be much better off. Again, this is visibly shaking up Lloyd because he doesn't want it to be the case, but I think a part of him is obviously acknowledging the fact that it's coming from himself, so there's a part of him that does believe it should have happened. But it allows Evil Lloyd to get up in Lloyd's face and allows him to whisper into his ear, but Lloyd once again denies it and tries to push through. And speaking of pushing, he does push Evil Lloyd, but what's hilarious is that whilst I pointed out all of the small moments where Evil Lloyd's been able to do a lot of harm from a simple maneuver, Lloyd pushes Evil Lloyd and he doesn't even move. It shows the contrast between the two, and Lloyd acknowledges it because he proceeds to hit Evil Lloyd, which does push him back, but it does lead to something fairly interesting. This is the first instance where something of note actually was done towards Evil Lloyd, and Evil Lloyd, by all accounts, does acknowledge this and actually does something to stop Lloyd from proceeding to do more, because this is the first time Lloyd actually does an attack against his good version of himself that actually had some form of meaning. He uses an elemental power to actually attack him this time, showing that Evil Lloyd was not happy with the idea that Lloyd actually got in a hit. Following this though does come the moment where the mirrors do come into play, showing a metaphorical and also a quite literal representation of the reflections of Lloyd. And Lloyd is visibly panicked by this, to the point where he even draws his sword just to try and counter Evil Lloyd. This is the first time a weapon is used, and honestly I think it was the beginning of something more interesting, because Lloyd draws a weapon which causes Evil Lloyd to draw a weapon and actually becomes more engaged with his attacks. It's like how Evil Lloyd was almost expecting it to happen and wanted it to happen so he could actually escalate it himself. Evil Lloyd proceeds to talk about how Lloyd even made the Source Dragons angry, a feat that's not easy to come by and definitely something that is worth note, because it's certainly something that is very important when it does come to the overall theme of Season 4, and this is actually the mark of the beginning of Lloyd's attitude change within this fight. Lloyd stops trying to resist all of these claims, stops trying to deny these claims, because he realized that he can't anymore, so he says that he understands that, he says he knows that. And I do think that is a very interesting point. Lloyd is finally accepting these things because he himself is telling him that. Evil Lloyd is still Lloyd, just a different reflection of him. So I do think that is interesting. But after that, Evil Lloyd does proceed to swing at Lloyd with his own swords, of course acknowledging the escalation of the use of weapons. And I do think this marks the beginning of Evil Lloyd actually trying to end the interaction, because if Lloyd didn't deflect it and if Lloyd didn't acknowledge it, it would have been the end of Lloyd. So I do think this is actually the beginning of Evil Lloyd taking things a little more seriously. Evil Lloyd just continues to throw the accusations at Lloyd, talking about how he's the reason the merged lands are unstable, talks about how it's all his fault that the Source Dragons aren't around. Lloyd acknowledges that. Evil Lloyd proceeds to tell him that he has done more damage to the merged lands than any villain could have done, more than Ra's, more than quite literally everything. Lloyd acknowledges that. All the while, Evil Lloyd is dragging his sword across the ground, as a means of distraction, or maybe as a means of intimidation. We don't really know, but again, it feels in similar vein to what we saw when he puts his hands behind his back, because Lloyd proceeds to pick up the blade and charges at Lloyd to attack him once more. Some heavy swings come in, but Lloyd is luckily able to deflect them, which is honestly quite lucky because they would have done something, but actually Lloyd's sword is thrown out of his hands and Evil Lloyd is very happy, takes his own sword out of his hands and tries to use an elemental blast to end things once and for all. He misses luckily. This is then the more interesting aspect of the fight for me, not because of the actual swings themselves, but actually just simply what Lloyd says. When acknowledging the Source Dragons, he actually defends his actions. He says that he had to anger the Source Dragons because he simply had to save the world from Thunderfang. And it's interesting that Evil Lloyd actually replies by saying it's just another excuse from the Green Ninja, and because of all of this he will never actually reach his own true potential. But the thing is that Lloyd genuinely does believe what he did to be right, and to an extent it is, because there was no other option when it did come to defeating Thunderfang. But it seems to be that Evil Lloyd just simply didn't care. It seems to be that Lloyd would have opted to have the world be consumed by Thunderfang over the Source Dragons destabilizing the world, which I do think is fairly interesting. But Lloyd's response to Evil Lloyd's declaration that he won't reach his true potential is even more interesting, because he hesitates, he walks back. He honestly is on the verge of giving up, and I think Evil Lloyd thought he was giving up as well. But Lloyd says it's not too late, he can still prove he's the chosen one, and this visibly shocks Evil Lloyd. He wasn't expecting this at all, and you can see for a brief second that he actually is fairly shocked by this. Lloyd then proceeds to hit Lloyd as well with his elemental power, again completely taking him off guard. Evil Lloyd thought he won here, but he didn't. Lloyd proceeds to use Spinjitzu to get back to his own blade and puts it back in his own hand. This has frustrated Evil Lloyd. Again, he thought he won, but he actually didn't. So they proceed to get up, and they proceed to have a sword fight once more. The smile is returning to Evil Lloyd's face, but I do think as well he is actually starting to get more angry in this moment, and shows because he's not being as significant as he was before this. Lloyd says that, well, simply put, there's nothing he can say to him because there's nothing he has told himself. And this precedes the line about Tully and the panting thing from his school. Yeah, I don't have much to add about that. This takes us back though to Evil Lloyd within the mirrors, and Lloyd is cackling. He's actually having a lot of fun in this moment. But when you actually listen to the laugh, it actually sounds like Garmadon's laugh. I don't know whether or not this was intentional, but I definitely do think in context it kind of works. An eviler version of Lloyd would be more like his father. But Lloyd again continues to berate Lloyd once more, talking about how he's not a man, he never grew up, he will never be as good as Wu. Lloyd actually does try to deny this, and Evil Lloyd is no longer allowing for the monologue. He takes Lloyd off guard and punches him and throws him back to the floor. Evil Lloyd just tells him that he doesn't understand his power, he will never be able to master it because he just doesn't know what it is. And Lloyd tries to defend himself in this moment, but again, Evil Lloyd just isn't having it anymore. Evil Lloyd wants this fight done. I think honestly he expected it to not go for this long, interrupting him again, just telling him that the world will fall, because Lloyd simply cannot do it. And Lloyd tries to fight this back, actually proceeds to raise his sword once more. But Lloyd actually kind of gives up here. Lloyd doesn't know what to do, and Evil Lloyd smiles, takes advantage of it, grabs him, and throws him out of the monastery. Evil Lloyd by this point has definitely won, because Lloyd just doesn't have it left in him. Evil Lloyd raises his sword, showing that he could end Lloyd at any moment, but instead opts to continue to tell him that he failed. Says that if he did this when he was younger, maybe he would have been able to pass. But as it stands, he just simply wasn't able to. The weight of every single failure, the lifetime of failures, was just simply too much. And simply put, that was it. So Evil Lloyd decides instead of the blade, use the powers to take him out of his misery. But Lloyd, in a last minute effort, proceeds to try and resist this once more, showing that there was a little more fight left in him. Lloyd catches Evil Lloyd's hands and proceeds to explain exactly who he is. Lloyd says that Evil Lloyd has hate in his heart. Evil Lloyd says that's correct, and it is for Lloyd. And Lloyd notes the things that he doesn't like about himself. The fear that has nowhere to go. The guilt. The bad feelings that is deep within. But Lloyd says that those need to exist because they would have not have made him the man that he is today. He needs those experiences to be able to do the good that he does within this world. Evil Lloyd doesn't really know what to do with this information, and I honestly think it enrages him more. Lloyd says he doesn't want to give Evil Lloyd any more power, and essentially surrenders in this moment. But like I said, Evil Lloyd, it is the most frustrated we actually see him get. He actually raises his voice in this moment and says he won't be able to conquer his own fears, and instead of ending him himself, he just pushes him off the cliff. And that actually marks the end of the fight. But it's weird because Evil Lloyd has not really come out the victor here. Lloyd has come out understanding the bad sides of himself, understanding where his fear came from. Evil Lloyd walked out more frustrated than before, and without the satisfaction of putting an end to the person that he hates. Which I think is funny, and I think it does tie into the reason why Lloyd, by all accounts, did complete the trial of the Green Ninja. I think that in this moment, Lloyd didn't win the fight physically, but in terms of the mental game, he acknowledged that Evil Lloyd is a very real thing, a very active part of himself, and he just simply needs to learn to live with that. He needs to learn to understand it, and he needs to learn to embrace the fact that ultimately he's made these mistakes, but he is still trying his best. Lloyd understands that he is not perfect. Lloyd understands that nothing about him is a straight line. Nothing about him is simple. Nothing about what he does is easy. But that's fine. With all of the small things that Evil Lloyd have pointed out, and all of the big things that Evil Lloyd have pointed out, all of them are very real. All of them are palpable. All of them are things that Lloyd thinks all the time. But it doesn't matter. Because Lloyd, at the end of the day, whilst making those mistakes and whilst angering the Source Dragons, he did them all for the right reason. He didn't do them to be selfish. He didn't do them for the reasons that the villains do a bad thing. He did it because he truly thought that it was the correct thing to do. And that is the thing that allowed him to win. That is the thing that allowed him to unlock the secrets of his own elemental power. The acknowledgement that whilst what he may do does have consequences, it is still ultimately done for the correct reason. And that is why I love Lloyd versus Lloyd. And I would like to know, what do you guys think of this fight? Do you see the details that I pointed out in this video? Do you like those details? Do you think that they're valuable when it does come to the overall theming of what this fight is meant to represent? I would love to know what you think, because I absolutely adore this fight scene, and I would like to know if you guys think the same. But thank you very much for watching the video, and I do hope you enjoyed. And if you did, please consider subscribing. I love discussing Ninjago with more people. And if you do want to support the channel any further, which you do not have to, you could always become a channel member and join the legends that you see on screen. Each of you, your support means the absolute world to me, and I cannot thank you enough. But like I said, that is about it for today, and take care. Okay,